Hi, and welcome to this second in our series of webinars brought to you by the Royal Literary Fund. I am your host. Now you can hear me. My name's Nick Ahad. I'm a writer and a broadcaster. And the last time in the first webinar that we held, I was joining you hot from a general meeting with a TV company. Nothing came of that, by the way, as often is the case. But today I'm joining you from the future, by which I mean it's approximately 10:30 in the evening here in an incredibly hot Goa, where I'm pretending to myself that it's possible to actually do some writing work while you're in Goa. Spoiler alert, it's not. Now, for those of you who did join our last webinar back in January, we talked about the reality and the identity of being a professional writer today. I had some brilliant guests. My guests were Emily Itami, Derek Keelty, and Karen McCarthy Wolf. And we talked just really honestly about what it's actually like out there for authors. If you missed that webinar, the good news is you can watch back via the RLF's website. Now, one of the things we talked about in that webinar was shame, the shame that some writers feel they aren't able to pay their bills purely with income earned from their writing. And the truth is, at least according to Derek and Karen, Emily, and a whole swathe of statistics, is that authors who make a living purely with their writing are in fact vanishingly rare. And even those who do pay the bills with writing, there is, as I'm sure a lot of you listening will understand, there's no guarantee. It's an unbelievably perilous profession, which is why today's webinar is going to ask the question, what happens when it all goes wrong? Or to put it in a way that, well, you, the audience, might really understand, plot twist, what to do when a writer's financial model breaks. I'm delighted to say that for this evening's webinar, I'm joined by Justine Palmer of the Royal Literary Fund and by Robyn Law, Head of Charities at the Society of Authors. Now, Justine, Robyn, I was trying to think of a way to put today's webinar title into my own vernacular, and I realised, as ever, somebody else has already said it much better. Robert Burns summed up what we'll be discussing today when he said, "The best laid plans of mice and men gang aft agley." And there's a reason I'm using Robert Burns' quote specifically. And it's not just because it's a perfect summation of what we're talking about. There's actually a deeper reason and a deeper connection that Robert Burns has with today's conversation. And at the end of this webinar, I'm going to ask Justine to reveal the connection. And actually, if anyone wants to take a guess at the connection between today's session and the Scottish poet, pop it in the chat. And that's also where you can submit your questions for both Robyn and for Justine. We'll leave plenty of time at the end to answer your queries. So let's kick off with our panelists tonight. There's only two of you. I think I'm going to let you introduce yourselves. So Justine, you're head of grants at the Royal Literary Fund. Can you explain what that means and what do you do?
Yeah, hi Nick. Yes, of course. I oversee the grants program here at the RLF. It's been running continuously since 1790. So I lead the team who help to prepare and to assess the applications from writers that come to us and go to our trustees. I also oversee all the strategy and policy work. I do some of the case preparation myself, but I'm quite often in the background.
And the date that you gave, I think, is a bit of a clue as to the Robert Burns connection.
Yeah.
Robyn, as well as being head of charities at the Society of Authors, you hold just a number of posts in charge of various funds. Could you sum up what it is that you do?
Of course. Hello, everyone. So at the Society of Authors, we have roughly 22 prizes and six funds that give away money annually. And a lot of those have different names. That's because they're often bequests and then therefore ultimately individual charities. So there's a lot of work overseeing all of those, from doing charity reporting to ensuring that you have judges and assessors who can make the decisions on where that money goes. But to say it really, really bluntly, I raise money and then I give money away.
We do like you. We do like you for doing that. Yeah, I looked at your list of titles. Like you're in charge of an awful lot of funds there. Listen, let's jump into this. I want to start with the whole plot twist moment. Again, something that our audience, I think, will really understand and relate to. Justine, what sort of circumstances have you helped authors through?
We really do see circumstances across the full spectrum, and that can range from when a writer's work has been disrupted due to a major life event, all the way through to when there is sort of a mid or long-term vulnerability that is continuing to go on. So there isn't a typical applicant that comes to us. But to give you a couple of examples of recent cases, it's sort of illustrate what we do. So the first one was we recently had were contacted by a writer who was a mother of three and had unfortunately recently divorced. And prior to the divorce, she'd had a really fantastic supporting job, but it required for her to travel to and from the job quite a lot. And trying to balance a supporting job, her writing, and childcare for three children was becoming really, really difficult, as well as that major transition that she was going through at home as well. And so by the time that she came to us, she had had to leave that supporting job. And so we were able to step in and help to cover some of the household expenses while she found a new job that fitted better with what their family needed as they were changing. But then at this sort of other end of it, we had a really lovely applicant, a gentleman who was in his 70s, who had been a writer and had written over 20 books by the time that he came to us, and was still working in a sort of long-term job that he held. And retirement was looming, and he knew that he wouldn't be able to cover his living costs if he were to retire, but also needed to. And so we were able to award him a 5-year grant, which allowed him not only to make that change, but also provided him with a bit of long-term stability. So moving out of work into retirement and sort of honouring his contribution towards literature. And he's still writing, I'm pleased to report.
Listen, we're going to dig into a lot of that, but I think the first thing to say is I imagine a lot of people will be very surprised to hear about those two very different circumstances that you wouldn't expect the Royal Literary Fund to be involved in a divorce and then someone looking to retire. Are you surprised that people like me are surprised to hear that that's something that you can do?
I'm not surprised, no. We've actually just undertaken a huge piece of work ourselves, which hopefully we'll be sharing more publicly soon in the next month. And we have really looked at the kind of grants that we give. So we're starting to break it down into 3 different types of grants, ranging from short-term support to long-term support. So we will be providing a lot more detail about the kind of work that we do and what kind of situations we're able to support in. But yeah, we always open to people coming to us and talking to us about what's happening to them and for them, to see if we can help. We're pretty open and flexible in that regard.
I will say that we've had a couple of questions in already in the Q&A. Some of those questions will be answered as we go through, and some of them we'll save till the end. We won't, I'm sure, be able to get to all of them, but we'll get to as many as we can. Now, Robyn, I mentioned how in that first webinar that we had back in January now, we grasped the nettle in our first one. We talked about the emotion of shame. Is that something that you see from authors when they turn to you in these kinds of positions?
Yeah, we get a lot of applications where people are saying, this is a really uncomfortable application to write. I feel very uneasy about asking for help. I know that, and sometimes you get a lot of kind of comparative language with people saying, I imagine there's a lot of people who are struggling worse than me. And also, I think sometimes when people have seen a lot of success at one point in their career, then having a name that's out there, having a recognizable kind of canon, and then finding that, as Justine said, anything can happen really, and then destabilize what's a pretty effective working model. So I think sometimes having had kind of success with your books then can make it really difficult to turn to a fund like mine or like Justine's, because you realize that actually there's a disconnect between how you're being perceived and what's actually happening, and acknowledging that can feel not like you're letting anybody down, but almost that there is a level of shame and embarrassment there.
One of the things that I think it's really important to stress, and again, we might come back to this, is the anonymity. In fact, Justine, I asked you for some case studies, and you were quite clear that that just can't happen because of the nature of the way these grants are given. What I will say, though, is that Robyn's just touched on it. We might be surprised by some of the names that might need to come to you, Robyn and Justine, for financial help. Would you think that's fair to say, Robyn?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And I think we would never, obviously, it's all completely confidential and we treat it with utmost discretion and we keep it between ourselves and the assessors that are looking at the applicants. Sometimes people do like to come forward and give quotes or kind of mention in their acknowledgements for works in progress, but also for some of our hardship grants. And that means that we can demonstrate to people that there is nothing wrong with asking for help when you require it. And that's what these funds are designed to do.
How do you cope with that, Justine? How do you get across that barrier of the shame? We keep coming back to that word. How do you get across to people that this isn't something to be afraid of admitting, that you might need some help?
I think it is a challenge. I think the first thing is having a conversation. And we're very aware that when writers come to us and are talking about these circumstances, they are, for us particularly, because we don't do writing grants, we are dealing with hardship and sort of personal circumstances. it can be the first time that those writers have spoken about it, whether that's a financial issue, a health issue. And often just by talking about it starts to help relieve that pressure. And I think also talking to us can be really helpful because we do see, although everyone is different, we do see these sort of patterns, or there are certain things that come through. And I think we like to assure people that actually often I think people are quite, I think we all do it as humans. We sometimes perceive what is happening to us as a personal failure rather than as something that is happening to us, or that we have been let down by the publishing industry or by the welfare system. And actually, by understanding that this is something that happens to people and it is not your failure as a person, but it is something that's happening to you, is how we try to approach it always. And we also try to make sure that we set people up not only with financial support, but other tools as well to help them through that. So one of the things that we do is we partner with an organisation called Penny Smart, who I think we will put a link through to them, who are an amazing community interest company who give advice on benefits and budgeting and debt. So where we are not able to give specialist advice, we will always try to partner with another organisation who can do that and can provide that service and who really understand it well and in depth. So I think part of that story is about having those conversations and realizing that you're not on your own, and there is a wealth of support there. It's just about tapping into it and finding it.
Yeah. And what you were
Robyn,
saying then about it's, oh, sorry, Nick.
please carry on now. I'm sure you're going to answer the question that I was going to ask.
I was just going to add that when you say it's no reflection on you as a person, I think it's also important to remember it's no reflection on your work. That
Mm.
I think sometimes not being able to make that kind of get that working model in place financially doesn't mean that you're not doing great work or that what you're doing isn't important. Sometimes there are other obstacles in the way.
Yeah.
Of
And
course, it's
I think
incredibly exposing to write to begin with, and so if you say you're a professional author and you can't pay the bills, then exactly what you're saying. Sorry, Justine.
no, I mean, I'm going to slightly put my neck on the line here. I might get myself in trouble, but I would say that I think that writers face a particular set of challenges around support from their own industry, from the welfare state, where they can actually fall through the gaps in a way that other professions don't, in terms of how they are treated as self-employed, how universal credit particularly responds to that, and accessing that support can be incredibly challenging and difficult for writers. And I don't think there is adequate support. And I think as a fund, we recognize that. And I think that other writers also recognize that. And through their legacies and their bequests, they have enabled us to support writers where that support is not in place where it ought to be. So we're really thankful to the other writers who are supporting one another through us to do that work.
And I'm sure we'll come back to some of that stuff about being self-employed and the benefits and that kind of thing. But Robyn, I was going to ask about the something Justine was saying about how the publishing industry is works in a certain way that makes writers perhaps feel like they're failing in some way. So a lot of people listening now will understand how advances are paid, but let's actually talk about what happens when an advance is paid, and let's talk about how and why that might cause issues.
Of course. So, when you are signing with a publisher, usually, I think in the past, almost always, but now sometimes, usually, occasionally, you will get an advance payment. That term advance can be slightly misleading because you're often given this big figure or this nice figure, and then you usually get a percentage of it on signing, a percentage on completion, and then potentially even smaller breakdown with further percentages when you get kind of to different print runs. That means that, and then you obviously have to take things like agents' fees off that, which is usually a further percentage. So you often are getting quite a small amount. Say, for example, your advance is £20,000, which I think for a lot of people would be unheard of these days, but would look on the face of it like a really nice chunk of money that would give you the time and space to complete the work that you've been asked to do. But in reality, you're receiving maybe £5,000 of that minus agent fees, and you're then expected to commit to writing whatever you need to do, doing your edits. If you're doing nonfiction, you might also have to write the whole book. You might have got the advance on a proposal rather than actually having a full manuscript. Then you've got to do your research. You've got to do travel. In some cases, you might have to pay for things like indexing. There's a huge amount of other costs that are sometimes hidden behind these larger figures. And in a lot of cases, people are seeing very small or no advances at all. In particular, poets often aren't seeing advances, and that can be a really big impact on your creative practice if you don't have the time the money and therefore the time and space to write. So even when there is that number, and that's not consistent, I would say these days either, um, it's often not actually reflective of what's going to end up in your bank account. And if if you do get £20,000 advance, fantastic. But if it takes you a year to write that work, that's not enough to sustain yourself, and it's certainly not enough to sustain your family over that amount of time. So then you're going to have to start doing supplementary things.
You just said no advances at all. How common is that?
We obviously see quite a small section of the industry because a lot of the information we find out about advances is either through our contract vetting service or through people applying to our work in progress grants where we ask for details of their advance. And that obviously is only a small section of the industry because it's only people who are applying to our grants or our members. However, I would say that you're seeing a huge number of people who just aren't receiving grants anymore. And I don't want to be on here and start waving a big stick at the publishers because I know that things are difficult for everybody. But I think that is a trend that you're seeing that actually these advances are not materializing for authors, which means a lot of writers are doing a huge amount of work for free before they're then getting to a stage where they're actually being paid for what they're writing. And that applies even more to those writers who do a lot of work already for free, like things like translators who are doing a huge amount of translating work to submit as part of their kind of proposal. That's already free work. And then you're kind of adding on extra stuff that you might have to do if you're not getting an advance. It's a shame because it is changing, I think, and trending towards fewer and fewer people receiving advances and receiving smaller ones if they are receiving them.
I really hope the people I'm working with aren't watching this. But so I work across mediums, and there is a thing that I'm doing, and I suddenly realized that I've probably spent several weeks writing essentially pitch documents, and I haven't been paid anything for it. And the hope is that we get commissioned, and then it will happen. But there's been no mention of money, and that's fine. I'm in a position where I'm happy to do that. I'm excited by the work. But Justin, is that a story that you're hearing quite a lot when it comes to advances and let's be honest, correct payments for authors?
Yeah, it is. It's sort of the backdrop against which all of our work is happening. And I think that because we are a hardship organization, actually that's kind of fairly fundamental to what's happening with the cases that are coming to us. They are lower advances, if any at all, and they are broken up. There are often delays, and it's really difficult for writers to plan financially when you can have the best intentions, then your publishing date gets pushed back by 6 months, and that's within your contract. And actually paying the bills, it's not easy to suddenly just sort of find the money for the rent or for that electricity bill when you have been relying on a particular income coming in at a set time. So yeah, it's definitely something that we see. And I think it is, I would say it's probably particularly pertinent to authors rather than dramatists, which is probably a slightly different conversation because of how pay is done and around their contracts. But certainly I think for authors, it's something that is sort of literally the baseline for every application that we see these days.
I have to say the RLF, you must, if you haven't yet, look at the website. They're extraordinarily helpful. You will, yeah, you'll find some great people, but also just some great information as well. I don't know as much about the Society of Authors. So, Robyn, tell us about the Authors Foundation Access Fund and help me with the pronunciation here, the Strachey Trust?
The Strachey Trust.
Strachey,
The
and
Strachey
how
Trust,
they
yes.
help an author.
Of course. I mean, with the Authors Foundation, we do have to give our thanks back to the Royal Literary Fund because that was originally, when we opened that fund in the 1990s, it was a call out to authors to support other authors and set up the fund, but also a very, very generous donation from the Royal Literary Fund. So they are also standing behind us and supporting us in our work, which we're incredibly grateful for. The Authors Foundation is a work in progress fund. So it's grants usually of 2,500 to 3,500, and that can be used for childcare, for research, for a research trip. It can be used to pay yourself a day rate while you're working so that you're not having to, if you're giving up other paid work in order to finish your work, then it can cover that. And it doesn't have reporting rules, so it doesn't matter if something happens and it takes you a little bit longer. We give you that money and we want it to go towards this work that you're going to produce. And there aren't a huge number of work in progress grants out there, so it's quite special in that respect. The Access Fund is a comparatively new one, which we are very indebted to Drusilla Harvey, who was the original reason why we were able to set that up, who left us an endowment. And that money is used for very, very small grants, actually. They're usually about £150, but sometimes they go from 50 to 75. And those are for access, as you would guess, to events, retreats. These can be self-directed ones where you're just taking kind of a weekend where you want to sit and write somewhere. So they cover things like transport, but also access, like getting something translated into a version that you can read or an accessible format, or food while you're working at the British Library, those kind of small boosts that can make a difference. If really, £75 is not something that you can do on your weekly budget, we're there to kind of say, look, this is a little grant that can help you over the line. The Straight to Trust
There will
grants.
be
Oh,
cynics. So I can't help
no, no,
but,
no, you go.
there's a journalist hat on here going, hang on a minute though, there'll be people thinking, surely that's so easy to take advantage of then, isn't it? If you don't require reporting, if you don't want to see the receipts, as it were.
We do see the receipts in that we make sure that they are under contract or previously published. So we ask for a track record, and we're asking for there to be reasonable understanding that this is going to see fruition. So it's not just you say I would like £5,000, thank you very much, and then wander off into the sunset. It's for those who have already been commissioned for that work or have been previously published, and so they have a manuscript that they're working on.
And you were going to tell us about the Stretchy Fund.
Yeah, so the Strategy Trust is very similar to the Access Fund in that you can get a grant to go and do research. This one is specifically to look at manuscripts, and we're very grateful to the Strategy Trust who give us the money to be able to help authors. So it's looking at manuscripts. So those are unpublished letters or manuscripts, and those have to be based in the UK. But there's a lot of archives that it might be unfeasible for people to reach, particularly when we're not thinking about people who are London centric. If you're based in the north, then getting to the British Library can be quite a prohibitive journey, and some of these aren't digitized.
Speaking of prohibitive journeys, I'm normally based in the north. I'm a Bradford lad. And I will just mention one more time that I'm in Goa. There's a fan directly above me, but if I turn it on so I can stop sweating, you won't hear me, which is why I'm suffering for you. Justine, you mentioned electricity bills, which I think some people might have been taken aback by. Sometimes the circumstances that see an author need support will present themselves as an emergency, like sudden illness, for example. Can you explain some of the other kinds of emergencies that authors might find themselves in and need to turn to you for?
Yeah, I think yeah, so when we talk about emergencies, we're talking about things where situations are changing very suddenly and there isn't time to adjust financially. I think two really good examples of where we see that. One is eviction notices, and writers who are finding themselves needing to find new suitable property quickly, and they might be in private rental. We know that trying to access council property can be really difficult. The waiting lists are very long. And so trying to find a deposit and moving costs to move to a new property, even if you find one, finding that extra cash can be really, really difficult for writers. It's even tougher actually for people who have accessibility requirements or who have children who need to be near to their school. So there are, sort of greater constraints around that. And there's situations that can escalate just really quickly. And there's a risk of homelessness. So that's a really good point where actually we can step in and help that transition to make sure that people have that security in their home. Another example of an emergency, which probably something we don't talk about very often, is bereavement. And when a writer comes to us or a member of their family comes to us, because we also support dependents of writers, not only is there sort of grief and the sort of emotional difficulty of dealing with that loss, there can also be an immediate financial pressure, paying for a funeral, or just the loss of the second income from a partner at home means that everything can just be really thrown into disarray. So again, we would like to relieve that pressure for somebody so they're not dealing with that stress alongside their grief as well. So those are two of the examples. So as I said before, we really see the full range of life actually, and the things that people are facing. Yeah, it's really challenging. So we do have a system we do have an emergency grant system. It's through our normal system, but we do have a process to expedite those really, really key cases that need to go forward a little bit quicker.
It's so great that we're here talking about this. I think this is a brilliant thing to be doing. Um, just so everybody knows, we're going to be talking for about between another 10 and 15 minutes, maybe, and that'll leave plenty of time to get through a lot of your questions, which I've got to say, if you have a question, a lot of them are being answered live, so do get them in. We're going to come to the Robert Burns thing in just a moment, but I'd like to give you both another opportunity just to underline the confidentiality, because I think this is a really key thing. I think it's wonderful that you're there and it's wonderful that we can approach you, but as well as the shame of yourself having to say I need help, there is the grave concern, I'm sure, that people might
Yeah.
find out about this. So Justine, I'm going to give you an opportunity just to talk about that. Explain why it's such a key part of the way that you give support.
I mean, it's absolutely fundamental to us as an organization. We aren't, we're not like other charities. We don't do grants for writing. And part of the reason of that is because many of the beneficiaries who come to us or who we're supporting aren't able to write or aren't able to work anymore. And so we have no expectation of return on that. We respect their output as a writer that they have contributed already, and we are supporting them through a point of difficulty. So we know that we're dealing with very, very personal circumstances for a lot of people. And so absolutely confidentiality is crucial to that. Everything is on a need to know basis. So cases are handled by one of three members of the team. So the two grants officers alongside myself and with our trustees who make the funding decisions. Again, like Robyn and Society of Authors, we will never disclose a beneficiary's name that they've had a grant unless they choose to put themselves forward. And again, some people really do want to talk about it and thank us, and we always thank them for doing that, but we would never have that expectation from them. And I think also for us, it's really important to note that when people are talking about their personal circumstances, finances, health, family life, whatever it may be, it's very separate to their personal and their professional identity. And we like to keep that separation as well for them.
Robyn, I mean, you've spoken about this already. Is there any more that you'd like to add to that?
Just to reiterate everything that Justine said, that it is a very need to know basis. And also with our entry forms, we try and keep them concise and so that we're only asking you for the things that we need to know. The things that are on there are only for us to establish eligibility and then to establish need. And we try not to make it so that there are pages and pages that you're having to fill out. We try and keep them simple. And also, if you are having any access issues or any questions, there are myself and my two colleagues in my team, Rose and Natalie, who are fantastic and are always willing to have a chat with you on the phone. I'm very happy to speak to people on the phone if they have concerns about it or if they want to go through a document together or if there's something we can do to support you. So, yeah, the confidentiality, and also we try and keep the process as easy as possible because we know that it's a difficult time, particularly for our contingency fund, which is our hardship fund grants.
And Justin, you do the same thing, don't you? Once an author has kind of been through the process with you, if they need your help again, it's quicker because you already know the situation in the background. Is that right?
Yes, so the first step for us is that a writer has to have passed literary merit. So it's part of our Royal Charter. So it's really for us, it's now been defined as sort of demonstrating that they are a professional writer with a serious literary practice. So that can either be through the amount of work that they have produced or the quality of the work itself. So when an applicant first comes to us, they do have to go through that process, but literary merit is then held in perpetuity. So the next time they come to us, we know them, we do keep casework on file, any confidential documents, bank statements, or doctors' letters that we've asked for do get destroyed as part of our GDPR process anyway. So we're not holding on to anything that isn't relevant, but we do have a summary of their case and their history as a writer. Yeah. So we do build relationships up with the writers who come to us, and we often have quite long relationships that carry on over several years, if not decades in some cases.
Now, so far we've talked about emergency situations, or, well, as Robert Burns said, when things have gone agley. Has anyone guessed yet, by the way, the connection? Someone can let me know. It's not just emergencies, though, that the RLF and SOA are there for. You want writers, Justine, to think about creating a network, sort of between themselves and organizations like yours. Why is that important?
I think that, the last 10 to 20 years, 10, 20 years, the publishing and also the dramatic arts, because I don't want to not talk about our screen and stage writers as well. They've changed a lot. And I think that often from what I see and from my experience of speaking with writers, that's often at their expense. And we know from the data that, writers are facing lower advances, lower fees, diminishing freelance opportunities. AI technology is taking over quite a lot. There's a lot of uncertainty that we're working with. And I think it's really important for us to create spaces and to invite writers to talk openly about what it is that they need and rather have it dictated to them, that they're part of that conversation and that we can respond to that as organisations who are there to support them. I think that's really important. I would, on a more personal level to us for the RLF, word of mouth is absolutely vital for us as a charity for people who to learn about us. When writers or people are going through a really difficult time, they're not thinking about, I'm going to look for a grant, I'm going to look at what organisations that are. They're just trying to deal with the day-to-day. And actually having those existing networks of writers who know about us, who know about the Society of Authors, who can talk to each other and say, actually, there's this organisation, get in touch, give them a call, is so important to the work that we do. So we always want to have like a call to arms for writers to talk about us and to reach out to the other writers that they know who might benefit from our help.
I knew about you because of a brilliant writer who was working with me as a dramaturg, and he encouraged me to apply for one of your fellowships. And so, yeah, there you go. It worked, and Kenny was effusive about you. Robyn, we're not just talking about financial support here, are we? We're talking about all kinds of other support, legal advice, mental health, help when it's needed. You're there. You're there for a lot, aren't you?
Yeah, so the Society of Authors is really about community as well, and I think that's something that Justine's touched on. But writing is a very solitary activity. And so I particularly mention when we have our kind of member get-togethers at Christmas, I kind of say, treat this as your office party. This is your office party. These are your colleagues. These are the people that you share the joy of writing, but also the difficulties of writing. And you can talk to them about your unique situation. So we really focus on community. We have special interest groups at the SOA, so things like the Children's Writers and Illustrators group or the Poetry Spoken Word group, which are kind of people grouped together by what they're writing. But we also have group networks for the situation that you're in. So we have a carers network that I actually am the coordinator for. So people who are having that unique experience of writing whilst acting as a carer, and also the ADCI network, which is for authors with disabilities and chronic illnesses. So these are ways that you can come together. In terms of the legal advice, we have an advisory team at the SOA, which is our biggest team, and it has a frightening wealth of knowledge about the industry. Some of them have been working there for decades, and they have this background of knowing what they can do for authors is incredible, to be perfectly honest. Never sign anything before you've spoken to the SOA and you've got them to look over your contract. So that's a really important aspect of making sure that when you do get a deal, it's the best deal possible, and they can really make a difference by being on your side and understanding the details of what you're signing up for when you're kind of putting your signature on that dotted line. I think we've also got something we can put in the chat, which is our mental health handbook, which is for freelance creatives, which I've just seen pop up there, which is an illustrated comic, which was from our Comic Creators Network. Worked really hard to promote and work on that. And it's just resources in terms of how you can make sure that you're looking after yourself while you're also trying to be creative, thinking about that, there's bits in there as well, like, you're going to have to do your own taxes at some point potentially, and that might be quite scary and challenging, but the SOA can support with that too and give you advice on those things that are not necessarily talked about when you think you want to become a writer, but actually become quite a fundamental part of looking after yourself and your finances.
I cannot wait to get in touch with you once we've finished this. I've got to say, Elaine Cusack says in the chat, didn't Robert Burns die penniless? And he worked as an accountant. You're on the right line. You're on the right lines. Someone has preempted my next question. It's about being self-employed. So, Justine, a lot of people watching this webinar, myself included, will be self-employed. It's a minefield. Self-employed writers are entitled to some benefits which are worth looking into. Can you tell us about tackling financial insecurity together? What is that? How can it help us? And what about Turn to Us?
Yeah, so Turn to Us is a brilliant UK charity, and they lead the work on tackling financial insecurity together. So they are a really useful resource, and they're offering lots of different tools. One of them, which I would always say everyone should have a look at actually, is they have an online benefits calculator. It's quite detailed, but it definitely takes you through it, and it says what you might be entitled to depending on your personal circumstances. And that does take into account if you're employed, unemployed, self-employed, have children, have a disability or long-term illness. So they really look at everything. They also have a search function for charitable grants. So I know we're definitely on there. I'm pretty sure Society of Authors are on there as well.
Yeah.
And they also give advice and information on lots of subjects like universal credit and PIP, which are those kind of really key benefits. Most of the benefits now have moved over onto universal credit, particularly for self-employed writers. I'm not a specialist in benefits, so I don't want to give any incorrect advice on this. But what I would say is that there is, we'll put a link in, there is information that's available on the gov.uk website, which is specifically about claiming universal credit when you are a self-employed writer. It is slightly different from other groups of people. I think it's also really important that we add, because it's not that well known, is that the DWP who run universal credit and other benefits, they're not currently required to give advice on benefits entitlement. So they can tell you, they can do the process with you, but they don't advise on what you might be eligible for. So we would always absolutely encourage people to speak to an independent advice service. That might be Citizens Advice. And there's also Advice Local, which is a really a fantastic service that links you up with who might be able to advise you for your particular area, for your region, because some benefits like housing benefit are administrated by your local authority and not by the DWP. So yeah, I would definitely, we're going to put some links into the chat, but I would definitely say speak to the specialist when it comes to benefits.
Really worth looking into. And Citizens Advice Bureau, nearly as difficult to say as the Royal Literary Fund.
Yes.
Now, in just a moment or two, we're going to open up the floor to you. If you have any more questions that you'd like to ask, pop them in the chat and I'll put them to Justine and Robyn. But I'm going to kick us off with this one. So, in the RLF's first webinar back in January, one of our guests talked about union rates as an important principle for writers. Robyn, can you explain what that means in practice and how the SOA supports writers to get fair pay?
So one of the things that we really push is the pay the creator idea, the campaign that's run by the Creators' Rights Alliance. And the Creators' Rights Alliance have an excellent freelance day rate guide that is accessible on their website. And it's really worth looking through because I think it's important to emphasize that the idea of a day rate, of that your time has value and you should be paid for it. And I think sometimes that's can be a stumbling block for authors when they're thinking about research that they're doing or writing that they're doing for a proposal for a manuscript, that they aren't necessarily equating that extra time because it's so assumed that you're doing that for free at the start of the process. So actually just considering that as part of the kind of a line of an invoice that you would put on that you spent so many hours doing it, and having an industry standard for what that amount we would expect to be. It's, it's the same as having London living wage. It's understanding that your time that you're putting into this should have a value attached, and here is a professional organization that is recommending what that value should be.
It's so useful because a lot of us find ourselves just plucking a number out of the air. So to have a rate card is extraordinarily useful for us to be able to say, this is what my industry says my day rate is. Mm-hmm. Let's turn to these questions here. Panel question one. Rufus would like to know, can Robyn explain how publication deals work and does it differ between genres?
Oh, I'm not sure I can. I could give examples of what you might kind of expect. What I would say is it's worth getting in touch with our advisory team, which you can do so via info@societyofauthors.org, if you have a specific deal in mind that you're looking at. I wonder if this is because I was mentioning the difference between poets getting advances less often than kind of other organize other writers. And I think maybe the difference that I can highlight with genre is that there is there's a lot of the time the kind of the poetry work that we're seeing coming out is from smaller publishers. So smaller publishers who might be doing chapbooks or pamphlets, and so they're less likely to have an advance attached just because the financial weight there is less because it's a smaller publisher, which is completely understandable. If you're doing kind of a crime book with Penguin Random House, you might see quite a bigger advance than obviously with somebody who's doing the smaller poetry work. So I think maybe that's what is coming that question is about. So genre will
Right.
often impact it, but that's often more to do with size of publisher. And I'm sure there are poets out there who are getting fantastic advances. These are just kind of general terms.
Yeah, essentially, don't decide to write poetry for the money. I think is what we can take away from that. Um, Question number two, Mark wants to say, oh, one of the biggest issues I face is getting the bank to understand the vagaries of income streams for a freelance writer compared with other self-employed people. Any advice? I think, Justine, maybe you want to lead on that one.
That's a bit of a tough one. I think it's also the DWP who have the same problem, I'm afraid. I think this is one of the struggles that writers have versus maybe other creatives, is the kind of, for lack of a better vernacular, feast or famine of how income can come in for writers, and that it can come in sort of big chunks and then nothing, and how that's managed. Um, I'm not a specialist in how banks operate, but I would really recommend speaking to organisations. Again, citizens' advice are great. There is another organisation which I'm not sure if we've got a link to, which is called Business Deadline, and they are sort of the equivalent to Step Change, but for businesses. But they do deal with self-employed and freelance people and give advice. They do debt, but they will also do sort of budgeting as well. I'd imagine, will have some really good ideas of how to speak to organisations, because it's something that they deal with really frequently.
And is it Penny Smart that you've mentioned
We
previously?
work with Penny Smart, and that's a referral-based service. And so they work very holistically. They look at debt, budgets, and benefits. So they will look, sort of do what they call a money health check. So they will get advice across all of those areas. And then if they don't do the work themselves, put people in touch with a partner organisation who can carry out particular work. Um, They work mainly in England and Wales, so I think the difficulty is Scotland and Northern Ireland are not able to cover, but Business Deadline do cover them, those areas. They don't do the benefits, but they do budgeting and debt, and they are a really, really fantastic service, also free to anyone who wants to contact them. Step changes for people who are in PAYE employment, so often people hear about them, but actually they're not always the right fit for freelance writers.
I think what's really useful, and what's really coming across, is that when you find yourself in these financially difficult situations, it's often the first thing you think is that you're on your own. And what's
Mm.
really clear is, quite apart from RLF and SOA, you have access to lots of other funds and organizations that are really there to help, Robyn. It feels like the most important message, perhaps, from this evening's webinar is you're not on your own.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think it's worth looking into. I think this it's so difficult, isn't it? Because when you're in that situation, you just think there's no one who can help me and this isn't going to work. But we're the SOA, because we run charities, we're part of a group called the ACO, which is the Association of Charitable Organizations. And going to those events and being in that organization, it does show you the breadth of grant giving organizations that are out there. Things like, we often recommend people, if we can't help them, we are able to, as Justine has said as well, we are able to kind of offer alternatives, things like the film and TV charity we've worked with quite frequently. There are charities out there who can help people who've ever worked in the service industry, who've ever worked in kind of restaurants or bars, ex-clergy. There's huge swathes of people, which I think might be of use to writers, because often people do have these portfolio kind of careers. If you've done other things, there might be other avenues that you might also be able to use at the same time. And we do try and do as much signposting as possible to those other charities, as well as to things that aren't necessarily um, for money, but where with mental health resources that we can also recommend at the same time.
It's great to hear. Um, I have quite a complicated question here for you, Robyn, but it does have,
Mhm.
it's really pertinent, you'll hear towards the end, to what we're discussing tonight. So, this is for
Mhm.
Robyn. What if you have not had a book published, but you do have a contract and you have already received an SOA work in progress grant for the project? I'm in this
Mhm.
position, says the commenter. I've been writing a non-fiction book for 3 years. My financial model broke over the past 18 months. Do I have any options?
Okay. I'm really sorry to hear that, first of all. But what I would say is, so if you received an Authors Foundation grant, you aren't able to apply to the Authors Foundation again for the same project. However, you can apply to some of our other funds. So, for example, if you did have additional research that you still needed to do for your nonfiction book, the Access Fund and the Strachey Trust grant would be available to you because you haven't been kind of excluded from them for that work. And I would also add that the contingency fund is always available as well. Having a grant from the Authors Foundation for a work in progress does not mean that you can't also apply to the contingency fund. The Authors Foundation has quite a long wait time because it is work in progress, whereas the contingency fund, you can get a response within 2 weeks from the SOA. It's really fast moving. So we often say if people are applying to the Authors Foundation and they are describing quite acute financial need, we'll recommend that they, in the meantime, when they're waiting for a decision from the Authors Foundation for, a research cost, they can get some immediate support for the kind of acute situation that's happening when they're in the process of writing whatever their manuscript is.
And did you explain what the amounts of the contingency fund are earlier?
The contingency fund, the average grant is so it's smaller than the Authors Foundation. The average grant is usually around £1,000.
Okay, great. I have another question for you, Robyn. For SOA work in progress grants, is there a time limit before you can reapply if you've been successful once?
If you've been successful once, we ask that you wait 4 years before reapplying to the fund, just so that we can help as many people as possible. And that's pretty standard across most of our grants. But once those 4 years have elapsed, we do invite you to apply again if needed.
Let me ask you the same question, Justine. Does the RLF have a time limit for reapplying?
It sort of depends on the situation. Our grant terms tend to be anywhere between 1 and 5 years. And if somebody is awarded a grant, we will tell them what that time limit is for their grant. So when they can reapply, it tends to be 3 to 5 years. But we do have a big caveat on that, that is that if there is extraordinary circumstances, if there is a huge change of something that couldn't have been known about before, then they can come back sooner and we will reevaluate. So we do have a sort of limit, but we are flexible and reasonable around that as well.
Now, I will mention again that there's been loads and loads of questions. A lot of them have been answered live. So if you want to get any questions in, we've got just a few minutes left. And I will be asking about the Robert Burns question as well before we say goodbye. Justine, you've got new categories of grants, I understand. Tell us about that.
We do. So the work that I mentioned earlier about looking at the categories, we have 3 new categories. So our first one is our back to work grants. And this is really aimed at those writers who've had a short interruption, a brief interruption into their working model, and actually reasonably with a little intervention for us, we'll get back into that working model. So that they tend to be quite short term and supportive, about 6 months of costs. We then have our sustainability and recovery grants. These are usually 3-year grants. They're aimed more at writers who either through caring responsibilities or illness are not able to work or not able to work at the same rate. So if they're undergoing treatment for cancer or have a child or a partner who is very sick or elderly parents, we will help take some of that financial pressure off. And we do that slightly longer term because we understand that they may not be able to return to work quickly and may not expect them to be working during that period. And then our final category at the moment is our literary contribution grants. And this is, I touched on earlier, this is our long-term support. And this is for writers who've really demonstrated their literary practice as a writer and come to us towards the end of their career or once they've retired, and for whatever reason are not able to support themselves financially. And so we provide long-term stability with income support for them through that retirement. And that is usually a long-term commitment that we make to them.
And I have a question here. I'll be completely honest with you. I'm not sure I completely understand this. I'll ask it and let's see if one of you two can work it out. Are the back to work grants means tested by DWP if you are already receiving universal credit?
So what I would say is that all our grants are deemed to be hardship grants. So that means that they are exempt from both tax and shouldn't impact benefits. The only caveat that I would say to that, and something that we work around, is how we pay out the grants. We used to pay them sort of as a lump sum. We tend not to do that anymore because the DWP have changed a little bit. And although they won't see the grant as income that is taxable or affecting their benefits, they may see it as an asset and a savings. So in that instance, we do tend to pay them sort of in smaller installments over a longer period of time so that people are still able to access benefits that they're entitled to receive.
While I'm waiting for some other questions to come in, I just want to go back to the title of our webinar, Plot Twist, What to Do When a Writer's Financial Model Breaks. Robyn, Justine, this is a difficult question. Will there be a situation where a writer comes to you and they clearly need financial help? However, there's also you need to be quite harsh and say, look, I think you need to find a different way to pay the bills or whatever it might be. This we can fix things for now, but as a long-term fix, this won't be what we can do. Robyn, is that a conversation you've had to have, and is it something that you might have?
So I stole some language from Justine to talk about this recently because we've worked together a couple of times now, and we talk about a lot about the working model,
Yeah.
which is fully something that I'm plagiarizing from Justine
Fine.
and the RLF because I think it so accurately describes what we are trying to support, which is,
Yeah.
and the working model can be the money that you're making from writing, but that can be supplemented with other things. In most cases, in almost all cases these days, I think it has to be. That could be teaching, it could be something that is very writing adjacent, or it could be something that actually just means that you have the space to be creative because you're doing extra things in order to pay the bills. And we try and distinguish between what we see as chronic and what we see as acute. And I think that's probably what you're getting at, that with the chronic cases, as particularly with our hardship grants, £1,000 might, cover a broken boiler. It might cover a month's rent. It might get you back to where you need to be so that you can carry on with your working model. But if there is a fundamental issue that's going on long term, £1,000, particularly with things like this cost of living crisis, £1,000 isn't going to go as far as it needs to be able to establish a working model. It can only really return you to one. And so those are the difficult decisions that some of our assessors are making. And that's why we try and offer a range of support in those cases where we might not be able to say yes because the fund is very oversubscribed in our cases at the very least. So that's why we try and offer other charities that might be able to help, other options that you might have, other ways in which you might be able to get back to that situation where you are able to be creative, but maybe whilst doing other things simultaneously. Justine, I've
You're
stolen all of
nodding
your
there, just
points.
No. I think for us there is the slight difference that sometimes the writers come to us aren't able to work. So yes, for the writers who are able to work, and again, like Robyn, we recognise that advances are very low. We know from the statistics that we saw from ARCS last webinar, the average income for a writer every year is £7,000, and that's not something that's sustainable for one person, let alone a family, to live off. So we do have an expectation that writers have supporting work unless they're not able to work. And then we would always encourage writers to apply for any benefits to which they're entitled. We can't replace benefits that people are receiving, but we can act as that gap because we also know that's not really enough. So it slightly depends on why people are coming to us and if they're able to work or not. But yeah, if people are of working age and able to work, we would have an expectation. We can help you through that transition of trying to get that new work if you're looking for it, and it's difficult because the job market can be quite difficult at the moment. But we do have an expectation that you will be moving into something that is sustainable for you and your own circumstances.
great. Thank you for dealing with that slightly. I mean, it's an awkward conversation to have. So,
Yeah.
um, listen, before we deal with Robert Burns and before I burst into flames, we've before we say goodbye, I've got two more questions for Justine. This is regarding the new categories of grants that you just mentioned. So first of all, I have published two novels and I have a ready to be published manuscript. How do I apply for a grant? Says one question. I'll let you deal with that one first.
So what I would say is go to our website. That's the first thing. It depends on what sort of support you need. So the type of grant that you need, whether that's back to work, whether it's there's something that means that you're not able to work and need a little bit longer term support. I'm assuming this person is not at, if you've got two books, you wouldn't be there for the literary contribution grants. That tends to be towards the end of a career. And if you put an inquiry to our team, they will check the work, make sure you're eligible and send details for an application form for the grant. We try to keep it as speedy as we can in that bit.
And again, on the new categories of grants, can self-published writers apply for these grants, or is it for writers who have been traditionally published?
Oh, it's a tough one. It's something that we talk about a lot. Currently, we're not able to accept applications from self-published writers. We, as an organisation, we do talk about this a lot, and we absolutely recognise that for many writers, it's a really sustainable and important way of getting their work out to their audience. Unfortunately for us, we are a small organisation in terms of teams, in terms of capacity. And with the world of self-publishing, there are writers who are working at a really high level and a really high standard, but unfortunately, there's also a lot of other work that is out there. And it's really difficult for us to be able to find a way to separate those out. We keep it under review constantly, but at the moment, we're not able to accept it, unfortunately.
Um, one of the last things I wanted to say was to say thank you for a brilliant webinar. But actually, Lynn has said it for me. She says, "Thank you, panel, for a raft of information around the diversity of support available that I never knew existed. Such a valuable detail." She said it far better than I could have. And speaking of people saying things far better than I could have, Robert Burns, today's discussion. Justine, can you enlighten us? What is the connection?
Yeah, so it was following Robert Burns's death. He did die penniless in 1796, so 6 years into us being up and running. And the fund supported his widow and their five, they had five young sons, all under age 9. I think one was born 4 days after he died. And so we supported them with a grant of £25, which doesn't sound like much, but I think I converted it and was just over £3,000, which I think would have helped them in that sort of immediate crisis.
So I guess the story to take away there is that if you are in this situation and you need to apply, you're following the footsteps of Robert Burns, so that's not bad footsteps to
Yeah.
follow in. Robyn, I want to ask you both your final thoughts. What is the final thought that you'd like to leave us with, Robyn?
I mean, I think you've already said it when you said you're not alone. And I think that's something that we've talked about a lot, and that there is nothing shameful about asking for help. And we are here to help in any way that we can.
Justine, sorry, I think she's stolen all your lines again. Would you like
Again.
to
No,
give the final
it's
thought?
fine. No, I mean, I think I was just going to reiterate what I said before, which is that actually we are here, and if you need help, or actually if you know another writer who needs help, come and talk to us. Get them to come and talk to us. We are here. We are always happy to have a chat and talk about what we can do. And if it's not something we do, we know lots of organisations who might be able to help, and we're happy to point you in the right direction.
Now, I will say we're getting lots of people saying thank you. You're very welcome. I've not done a great deal, but I'm sat here sweating. Thank you very much to Justine and Robyn. Someone said, can you add the links to a web page as I can't download the chat? I think if you go to the RLF and the SOA websites, you'll find all of this extraordinary detail, this amazingly helpful detail there. Just to remind you, we do have a third and final webinar coming up. That's in July. If you sign up, you'll find all the details. And we have a survey that we'd love for you to fill in that you're going to see on screen. But for now, thank you so much, Robyn Law. Thank you, Justine Palmer. Thanks to you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.